Summer, 1944. Central Texas. The sun hung mercilessly in the wide sky, beating down on endless rows of cotton stretching to the horizon. A convoy of trucks pulled up to the edge of the fields, kicking up dust clouds that shimmered in the heat. From the back of the truck stepped dozens of German prisoners of war, their dark fatigue uniforms hanging loosely on sunburned shoulders, their boots caked in dust from the journey. For many of these men, pride had once been found in polished boots and gleaming rifles. Now they stepped into soil with calloused hands and tense uncertainty, carrying hoes, sacks, and plows instead of weapons. By then, more than 300,000 German prisoners had been brought to the United States. Small towns across Texas, Arkansas, and the Midwest had grown used to the unusual sight. Groups of foreign soldiers working not behind locked cells, but in wide fields, under only a handful of guards. Locals had learned to live with them, some glancing with curiosity, others carrying on as though nothing unusual was happening at all. The prisoners expected farm work to bring back a sense of control. They believed that after years of training as soldiers, their strength and discipline would set them above the local workers. They stepped into the cotton fields, confident that the hours ahead would be tough, but manageable, a kind of labor where their vigor could still set them apart. But when they looked down the rows, their expectations collapsed. There, moving already among the plants with practiced rhythm, were crews of African American and Mexican American farm workers. Their hands flew quickly down the rows, filling sacks with a steady pace born of years in the fields. Broad hats shielded faces from the glare, voices carried in song or conversation, and rows disappeared behind them in neat, harvested order. Within minutes of picking, the comparison was striking. The German captives moved slowly, stopping often, their hands unaccustomed to delicate plucking and heavy sacks. Sweat gathered on brows, boots dragged, shoulders stiffened. The local workers, meanwhile, pressed on without complaint, their speed steady, their knowledge of crop and soil transforming what seemed back-breaking work into fluid precision. One by one, the prisoners glanced at each other, realizing the truth. Men who had never seen themselves as laborers were already falling behind. The claims of superiority they had carried in their minds, the sense of discipline that had survived defeat, now seemed fragile in the face of rows of cotton disappearing beneath the workers' calloused fingers. For men once trained to see themselves as strong and unyielding, it was a revelation they were unprepared for. In the dusty fields of Texas, their first true lesson was not in combat, but in labor. And the reality was impossible to ignore. The men they had underestimated were not only equals, they were stronger, faster, and unshaken by the same sun that left the prisoners already weary. The shock of that moment would stay with them long after the harvest ended. By 1944, the United States had become an unexpected host to one of the largest prisoner movements of the war. Nearly 370,000 German soldiers were shipped across the Atlantic and placed far from the battlefields they once marched upon. They arrived in quiet parts of rural America, pine forests of Louisiana, the endless prairies of Texas, farmland in Kansas, and orchards in California. The reason was practical. With the U.S. Army fighting overseas, the home front suffered a severe shortage of manpower. Millions of American men were drafted, leaving farms, factories, and logging camps desperate for workers. Crops risked rotting in the fields. Railroads lacked hands to move freight. Timber sat uncut. In a nation of abundance, the danger of waste loomed large. For Washington, the solution was both simple and bold: put prisoners of war to work. The rules of the Geneva Convention allowed it, provided that the labor was not military in nature. Farms, logging sites, construction crews, and food processing plants became destinations for thousands of men who had once worn enemy uniforms. And so, small towns across America saw an unusual sight: captured soldiers working alongside locals as if part of the community. But it was in agriculture, above all else, where the POW labor program grew most visible. German soldiers found themselves suddenly thrust into the world of American farming, picking cotton, cutting sugarcane, harvesting wheat, and helping to feed the nation they had once fought against. Most believed at first they would stand apart. Many prisoners of war arrived with an ingrained sense of discipline and strength. Even in defeat, they carried pride in their training and background. Some quietly expected to outwork the local hands who lacked military polish. What they didn't realize was that the fields of America were not a rehearsal ground for strength. They were the real test. Generations of African American families had worked those fields, their knowledge of soil, heat, and rhythm unmatched. Mexican American migrant workers, too, many moving season to season, were veterans of rows stretching endlessly across the land. While German captives were strangers to the soil, these men and women were experts, hardened not by boot camps, but by years of survival through hard labor. The farms became classrooms of humility. Each day the prisoners filed from camps at dawn, their work clothes marked with the bold letters PW. Locals looked on from porches as the convoys rolled past, guarded lightly by young GIs. From afar, the scenes often resembled ordinary agricultural crews. Men bent in rows, women hauling baskets, supervisors standing at the edges. But among them marched men who only months earlier had carried rifles for Hitler's armies. And it was in these vast fields, standing shoulder to shoulder with the very people their beliefs had dismissed, that the collision between ideology and reality struck hardest. Here, propaganda met practice. Here, the myth of supremacy buckled beneath the weight of cotton sacks and blistered hands. The first days in the fields revealed more than sweat and sore hands. They revealed a paradox that none of the prisoners could have imagined. When German POWs bent their backs to pick cotton, they believed discipline and soldierly toughness would see them through. But they quickly discovered America's fields were as demanding as any battlefield. The summer sun scorched without mercy. Cotton plants tore at their fingers, leaving blisters that turned raw by noon. Dust clung to tongues. Boots sank heavy into furrows. And the hours stretched endlessly. And always, just a few rows away, the locals worked faster, smoother, endlessly. African American crews, some descendants of generations who had labored on the same soil, moved with practiced rhythm. In the rows beside them, Mexican workers swung deftly through the stalks, their sacks filling at speeds the prisoners could scarcely follow. What took a German an hour, these men did in half the time. By midday, the difference was staggering. The POWs sweated heavily, pausing, fumbling with aching arms. The locals pressed on steady, their movements born of experience. Picking cotton, stripping corn, cutting cane, all were tasks that demanded not brute strength, but skill and familiarity with the land. And it was this exact skill that broke through the wall of arrogance. One prisoner later recorded, "We thought ourselves hardened men, yet beside us they worked without stopping, filling sacks while ours lay nearly empty. It was then we knew discipline was no match for their knowledge." The humiliation stung deeper than simple fatigue. For men who had marched under banners of superiority, the sight of being outperformed shattered illusions. They looked to their guards, expecting scorn. But the guards rarely mocked them. They were indifferent, casual, barely conscious that something ideological was unraveling before their eyes. Worse still, many of the local workers laughed not cruelly, but naturally, amused at the foreigners stumbling over rows that to them were second nature. A few even offered advice, showing prisoners how to brace a sack better, or how to angle their fingers to avoid cuts. And yet, what shocked the Germans most was not the skill itself, but the authority that followed. On several farms, local foremen placed African American or Mexican workers in charge of supervising POW details. For German officers raised in the rigid hierarchy of race and class, this reversal was almost unbearable. Men they had once dismissed as inferior, now barking instructions, correcting mistakes, setting the pace. And the worst part? Those men were right, the prisoners truly needed guidance to keep up. Reports from the U.S. Farm Security Administration noted the irony. Prisoners who once considered themselves elite soldiers were learning the basics of American farming at the hands of those they had never expected to obey. Day after day, the lesson repeated. Germans lagged, others excelled. By week's end, the contrast was inescapable. For many prisoners of war, ideology didn't collapse under a barrage of Allied artillery. It collapsed under the weight of a cotton sack, carried effortlessly by the workers who had done it all their lives. And so the fields became a mirror. In every row, in every bushel, the prisoners saw their beliefs erode. What they had been taught as unshakable truth faltered beneath the rhythm of men who carried no banners, no slogans, only practiced hands and the steady pride of their labor. Of all the defeats these prisoners endured, none cut deeper than this: to be outworked on the very ground of their captors' homeland. The farm rows delivered their first sting, but perhaps what unsettled the prisoners most were the moments beyond the fields. America's towns and communities revealed truths that clashed violently with what they had been told in Germany. When convoys carried prisoners from camp to work, civilians gathered along roadsides not to curse them, but out of simple curiosity. Children, restless on porches, stared wide-eyed at the columns of uniformed men. Some lifted their hands to wave. A few even laughed, as children do, their innocence blind to the hatreds of war. For the prisoners of war, it was disorienting. They had expected to be jeered, spit upon, mocked. Instead, the youngest Americans offered smiles. Inside the towns, the contradictions deepened. German captives watched women stride confidently through shops and post offices, managing farms in their husbands' absence, and even driving the massive farm machinery that the POWs struggled to master. In some canneries and warehouses, women issued direct commands to mixed crews of local workers and POWs, and the guards astonishingly expected the former soldiers to obey. Back in their homeland, women were seldom seen in positions of visible authority. To encounter them in America, not only working independently, but also supervising prisoners, was more jarring than any armed guard could have been. But it wasn't only gender that challenged assumptions. Race delivered its own reckoning. Many German POWs had been raised in an ideology that defined entire peoples only by hierarchy. Yet in towns across Texas, Arkansas, and California, they found themselves laboring beside African American and Mexican workers who moved with skill they could not match. Even more disruptive was when locals placed these same workers as foremen, above them men, with the authority to correct their pace, to show them how to improve, to measure their yield at the end of a day. For the prisoners of war, this inversion was almost impossible to process. They had believed superiority was owed to them by birth, yet here they were, fumbling under the instruction of those whom their homeland propaganda had maligned. And while humiliation stung, the quiet reality pressed harder still. The workers were right. They truly did know better. The contradictions did not stop there. At mealtimes, they discovered Americans ate without separation. Black, Mexican, and white workers shared spaces in fields and sometimes in dining halls. Segregation still scarred much of the United States, but even those imperfect glimpses of cooperation challenged the rigid categories drilled into the POWs' minds. More shocking still was American openness. Farmers complained openly about crop quotas in the presence of guards. A man shouted angrily at a Department of Agriculture agent over a scale dispute. In Germany, such defiance toward authority would have been met with swift and brutal punishment. Here, in the open plains of Texas, it passed as ordinary banter. No one was arrested. No one silenced him. One prisoner, later interviewed after the war, admitted, "We believed America weak because it argued with itself. But I saw then that their arguments made them stronger. We worked as they debated, and the work continued regardless of complaint. That was when I first understood America differently." For the German POWs, the experiences were a slow drip of astonishment. Women in the driver's seat of tractors, black soldiers standing guard with authority, Mexican foremen, faces shaded by wide-brimmed hats, cracking jokes as they set the day's pace, children running along fences laughing at men they had once been taught to fear. Each moment tore another layer from propaganda's shell. Each encounter chipped away at illusions of superiority. And while rifles and tanks had captured their bodies, it was these smaller shocks, the casual authority of women, the strength of minority workers, the laughter of civilians, even the openness of complaint that captured their minds. For men who thought themselves unmoved, America's everyday life became the most unanswerable weapon of all. When the war ended in 1945 and prisoners began their long journey back across the Atlantic, many carried with them more than memories of guard towers and barbed wire. They carried memories that unsettled their very sense of identity. They returned to a Germany in ruins, where cities lay in rubble and families struggled with hunger. But they also returned with stories that few people at home wanted to believe. How could it be true, they were asked, that in America they had been fed well, housed decently, even allowed to walk through towns? And how could it be possible that the very workers their homeland propaganda had treated as lesser African Americans, Mexican Americans, and others had shown them skill, resilience, and endurance that outpaced their own? Yet the prisoners knew it because they had lived it. For them, the cotton fields of Texas or the citrus groves of California were not just labor sites, they were classrooms. Harsh, dusty classrooms where pride was stripped away one row at a time. Some former POWs admitted in memoirs and interviews that this was the first time they truly doubted the ideology under which they had gone to war. Confronted daily by workers whose strength and expertise shattered stereotypes, they began to ask themselves questions that had never been asked inside Germany. One recalled, "We did not expect it. We thought ourselves stronger, more disciplined, yet they outworked us and then laughed while we struggled. That day, I understood that the lies we had believed were only that lies." Another wrote of the kindness that sometimes came after the humiliation, how workers offered food, or showed them techniques, or treated them as simply fellow men in the field. These small human acts cut through years of indoctrination more effectively than any pamphlet or speech. The shock of these experiences lingered. Years later, some former POWs went so far as to say that it was not in the prison barracks or the guard towers that they most strongly felt the collapse of what they had been taught. It was in the fields, bent low beside men who worked harder than they could, while laughing and singing songs in languages they barely understood. The ideology they had carried across oceans cracked, not under bombs, but under the weight of harvested crops. When post-war Germany sought to rebuild both its cities and its spirit, these memories mattered. Former POWs took part in conversations about democracy, fairness, and dignity. Their voices, shaped by the strange lessons of American farms, carried influence in their communities. They had witnessed, in the most basic of terms, a truth that could not be hidden. Strength and skill belong not to race, but to experience, knowledge, and perseverance. And for those who never forgot the humiliation of failing beside workers they once despised, the memory remained sharp. When asked years later about his time in Texas, one prisoner summed it up with plain words, "It was not their guns that humbled us. It was their fields. And in those fields, we saw a truth our leaders never told us. In the end, the greatest blow to ideology did not come from the battlefield. It came from cotton picked faster, corn husked cleaner, and rows finished sooner by hands the Germans once thought unworthy. For men who expected to rule the soil, America's farms became the most enduring teacher, that dignity and worth are measured not in theory, but in labor, sweat, and humanity. And that revelation, as shocking as it was, outlived the war itself.